Fine. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first in a new series of the Strengths-Based Learning Programme. So, our session today is going to essentially be a refresher of the Strengths-Based Learning Programme that we ran and delivered last year. The slides will be sent out, and each of them has a link to the sessions that we recorded last year. And I'll go into a bit of detail for those of you who maybe weren't able to be part of it last year, just about where this program came from, why it's 2 hours long, and why and how we intend to use that space. So yeah, welcome. Thanks everyone for joining us. So if I can get this moving, yeah. So yeah, we'll cover a very, very brief recap of what we covered last year in last year's programme, explore some of the key themes, but we'll also share a preview of our systems change pack that we developed, which is soon to be published, which was part of our New System Alliance kind of outcomes as well. So how did we get here? That's probably the first good space to start, which is about 4, 5, maybe 6 years ago now. Platform were part of started to become part of something called the New System Alliance with our partners Mayday Trust, Changing Lives, and Homeless Network Scotland. And the aim really was to think about how we can set up a network of organisations and people who are really interested in shifting the system. And by the system, we mean lots and lots of different systems altogether. And part of that journey from Mayday Trust involved the use of coaching, person-led transitional strength-based approaches. Mayday Trust then set up a coaching group which met at least once a month, which became a strengths-based group once it expanded out of just coaching. And that was a really helpful space for a lot of coaches. I know Platform's coaches, when we adopted that approach, would go to that. And it became a reflective space really for people to kind of talk about how they could best implement both coaching and strengths-based approaches. At the same time, the New System Alliance was holding a wide range of events and conversations across the housing, mental health, social care sector. And where we were across that network, really piloting different practical ways of delivering coaching or strengths-based work. And then we're coming back and staying in touch with some of those reflective spaces as well. All different partners within that network and people who would engage were thinking about different ways of working, so different ways of adopting relational approaches. I know that's where we went to within Platform, moving much more into the trauma-informed relational way of working. Once we then merged with Mayday Trust a year and a bit ago, we inherited that group, that practice group, which was a small but perfectly formed group of people who would attend very regularly and talk about really interesting, difficult, complex, exciting, inspiring things. So we thought we would really want to create a series of events that maintained that connection to reflective practice, but that also would start grappling with some of the real challenges or the real kind of themes, I suppose, of embedding strengths-based working. So last year, you'll see as we go through this event, we picked out sort of 6 key areas that from our experience of delivering coaching and relational ways of working, and from the conversations across New System Alliance and some of our partners, we understood that these were some of the key foundations or the key stumbling blocks, depending on how you interpret it, to strengths-based working. And that's where the programme came from. And we've done the same for this year's programme as well. So there's a bit of repetition, but not much, because we've also thought we would extend that and think what other barriers are there. So hopefully these will be really useful. The way it works is we tend to do up to an hour, maybe a bit longer depending on the content, of kind of a learning session. And then we have a break, and then we come back and it then becomes a reflective space. And we can either reflect on what we've talked about, or people can bring challenges that they're facing internally or externally to their own strengths-based working. The first hour is always recorded so that the content is shared. And then the second hour is always confidential and not recorded because it allows us to then have conversations about things you might be struggling with. And some of those conversations have lasted for the full hour, and some have lasted 20 minutes, and we don't try and force people to spend time on that. So, the key thing for us then is this bespoke training package, using the phrase training in its broader sense, which is a space for people to hear about our experience and the experience of people that we admire or inspired by. But then, like I said, identifying that space for reflection and learning. So, our first session, which I think was in March last year, Pete, was looking at reflective practice. So being really quite open about the fact that a lot of the spaces we occupy, a lot of the work we try and do, particularly if we're looking at strengths-based working, requires, it doesn't just benefit from, but almost requires us to be reflective within our practice. And one of the these are some of the themes that emerged from that conversation. So the reflective practice can be scary and it can be hard, and both can be true. That people, when we spoke to them in the first session, people were saying that it was quite tricky to find the time definitely to do it, but they were nervous about what would it unlock? If people were sharing that they might struggle, or that they might be worried about sharing something, or they might be judged if they admitted or shared that they were struggling. There was a real sense from people that actually what the risks of reflective practice and how can we hold some of that uncertainty. Finding the time, this is something that we've definitely found at Platform from when we've tried to implement reflective practice. We were in conversations on Tuesday, myself and Pete and Sean and others, about, well, how do you encourage people to find that time? Because when you've got a certain amount of people that you need to see, a certain amount of outcomes to meet, or your certain kind of contract level that's been set by kind of commissioning, how are you going to find the time? It's often the time to reflect and think that feels almost impossible in the system as we have now. So the worry as well about what might be unlocked and really where to put that. So there was a real concern that if people came together and started talking about some of the concerns they had, well, actually, maybe everyone will just realize how stressful and awful it is, and everyone might leave. We did have people sharing that, or actually people might realize that they don't want to be a caseworker, support worker anymore, that it's too much. Those were not flippant or blasé. People genuinely felt that, but they were kind of at the more basic side of the worries. Other worries included, what if it tells us somehow that we have a toxic culture? Or what if we realize that it's not possible to do the job in a meaningful, effective, or strengths-based way? So those were some of the worries about reflective practice. But it was also clear that people understood and shared that it would help people understand context more. That for a lot of people, they understood that if they could sit down with people or stand up, you can do reflective practice anywhere, and actually say, well, what is it that's driving some of this behavior? Really either understand, we at Platform, we might use things like post-event surveys, or understand, not surveys, post-event conversations to understand maybe why someone kind of erupted by being told no, or we might do pre-reflection by kind of sitting there and understanding, well, this might be a difficult conversation we're about to have, so let's reflect together on how you'd like it managed. So it can really help us understand the context. It can help people understand more clearly that actually, if you've worked in stressful, difficult, scarcity enforced services for 10, 20, 30 years, your context is going to be quite brittle. Your context is going to be that you are quite vulnerable to stress, worry, uncertainty. And by listening to each other and understanding that context more, we will be able to make changes. As a result of that, you can then start enabling that creation of better conditions in the workplace. And you can unlock answers to stubborn problems. And I hesitated before using the phrase stubborn problems here because focusing on problems obviously is not a very strengths-based way of thinking. But I've used it so that I can just be quite blunt and direct with people that a lot of the time, taking the space to step back, talk with a colleague, or reflect with the person you're supporting can open up different options and different routes. So it isn't just a case that reflective practice can bring out a lot of worry and negativity. It can also absolutely give you that space to go, why didn't we think of that? Or actually, yeah, we could just do this and that would really help. And that's really important. And crucially, we'll give practitioners space to think. I think everyone on the call today, whether we've met or not, I am pretty sure I could guess that in your work lives, you are constantly rushing and rushing and rushing, whether that's with 15-minute care and support appointments that your team might have to offer, whether it's that you have to see a certain amount of people in a day, whether it's that your contracting arrangements don't allow for you to take flexibility and work differently with people. Whatever the issues are, one of the big pieces of feedback we get from people all the time is there's just no time or space to think. So committing to reflective practice can be all of those things. It can be scary, hard, difficult. It can create worry, but it can also be refreshing. It can help people with healing. It can help people really address some of those stubborn challenges as well. And then session two, which Sean on the call delivered, we really wanted to set the context for what do we mean by mental health at Platform, because in terms of delivering strength-based approaches, it's really difficult to deliver a strength-based approach when you are working in line with a broken, traumatized mental health system that's reliant on outdated medical approaches. And we make no apologies for that Platform. It is not possible, really. You can soften it, you can amend it, you can be a bit better. But if you are essentially relying on an outdated model, it's almost impossible to deliver strengths-based approaches in a meaningful way. This is the only one of those sessions that we didn't record, so we will be repeating it in this strengths-based learning program, so people have got a chance to access it again. And essentially, I've shared maybe three of the key elements of that session today. One is on the left. You can see again. Sean will know that this is slightly outdated because it doesn't have the fawn response in, and I can guarantee when Sean does it next month, it will be fully up to date. But essentially, that model helps describe the sense of overwhelm people might find themselves in. I won't go into detail today, but suffice to say that when people are kind of in that green social engagement zone, that's when people can reflect. That's when people can understand kind of accountability. It's when people can have good, open-hearted conversations. And most of the time, if we're in situations that are in any way anxiety-inducing, a lot of people bounce around a little bit like the oscillating line between the red and the green. We'll be able to go in between, in and out of being regulated or dysregulated. But fundamentally, a lot of the people that we support and a lot of ourselves as well, because there isn't some arbitrary distinction between the two, we'll often find ourselves spiking much more. We'll go into fight, flight, or freeze, or fawn. And that's where our threat responses are activated. And it can be really hard then for us to become regulated and grounded and actually kind of reflect, like we were talking about earlier. A lot of the time, when that becomes kind of hardwired into the way we think and the way we respond, that can then lead to us being given diagnoses. It can lead to us being seen as something different rather than having experienced trauma or something that provoked that threat response. The second image is around attachment. And I won't go into huge amounts of detail there, except to say that kind of logic, that philosophy is something that we've tried to really ground throughout Platform. That strengths-based working requires an understanding of the threat responses that we experience as human beings, but also the protective factors, of which one is attachment, the ability to feel protected, the ability to name and understand our different emotions. And that's where the importance of having a secure base that you can go out and explore from, whether that's a supportive manager, a supportive parent, or someone, a supportive support worker, to go and challenge people in a safe way to go and take risks, to go and explore, to really push themselves, but also that safe haven for people to come back to. So if something goes wrong, or if people get scared, or if they hurt themselves, or if someone announces huge benefits cuts on a spring statement, people can then come back and have support and really come back to support workers or parents and actually understand that they are going to be held. It's not something, sadly, that runs throughout all of our services. And where we would say, and again, I know Sean will go into this in more detail next session, where it sometimes comes unstuck is people often feel it can become quite parochial or quite, I can't remember the word, if almost controlling, people doing things on their behalf. So actually what we talk about here is you're providing a safe and secure base. You're not telling people what to do. You're making sure that they feel supported and protected. And then finally, the social determinants of mental health, which is really, really important. That actually, I mentioned just now, the spring statement yesterday. Those are political choices. It is a political choice to reduce people's income. It is a political choice for us to have a housing system that doesn't provide people roofs or good quality housing. It is a political choice to have a criminal justice system that doesn't work, and it's a political choice to perpetuate decades of spiraling educational inequality that lead to poverty. Those are political choices. They may be political choices people think are necessary. They may be political choices that people are making for specific and well-meaning reasons. They are still choices. And what's really challenging then is with our physical health, we understand that things like physical stress and mold and poor quality housing, bad ventilation, we understand instinctively, I think, although that's built on decades of evidence, that that will have an impact on our physical health. And yet the length of time it's taking for us to understand that that also impacts our mental health, we are slowly catching up. So those are the three elements very, very briefly. And I know Sean will go into much more detail next month about that, which really summed up what we meant by mental health within Platform, that there is a very personal element, our own threat response. There is the understanding of our attachment needs and the protective characteristics that we have as individuals. And then there is the social context, so the social determinants that drive and perpetuate those cycles of spiraling inequality. Session three was a really interesting one, which was looking at how we share our impact. So one of the key elements that came through from a lot of our conversations around strengths-based working was people's kind of nervousness that some of what we often describe as softer stuff, which is not soft, but we describe it as softer stuff. So the ability to have a cup of tea with someone, the ability to go for a long walk, the ability to go to a line dancing class, that actually those are often described or dismissed in some cases as the soft stuff. But actually, we know if you've ever worked in any kind of strengths-based environment or support environment, that's where the magic happens. That's where most of the trusting relationships are built. That's where most people end up feeling more comfortable with their support workers, friends, family. It's where it all happens. So how do we capture that? So this session, which is available to watch, I would encourage you to do that because the person we had to speak about that was absolutely an expert, and I am not one. But essentially, was talking about the world being extremely complex, and that we need to try and avoid where we can that reductionism, that sense that numbers alone or stats alone will tell us exactly how effective or impactful we are. And that crucially, people make sense through stories. And you'll see that in this year's strengths-based learning program, that storytelling is a really key and fundamental part of both people making sense of their own experiences, but of us using stories to tell system stories, to tell stories of change as well. So people as well like to be included. So people like to be included in gathering evidence of impact. People like to be asked how their journey has gone. People like to be encouraged to share their story. You know that often people don't like filling in surveys and giving loads of numbers or saying where on a star outcomes scale they are now compared to where they were 3 months ago. You know, some people do warm to that, but people tend not to like reducing themselves to a number, but actually sitting down with people and asking, what are your, tell us about the most impactful thing that happened to you during your time with us. People tend to open up more to that as well. And that people, whether that's commissioners, providers, people we support workers themselves, people learn through talking and thinking together. And so it was really important in that session that lesson came through. That huge communities or really powerful, close-knit communities and relationships can be built by sharing those stories. You can break through a lot of barriers that build up over the years and generations by sharing meaningful stories with people. And that session culminated in exploring what's called the most significant change method, which I won't try and butcher now by explaining, but I would encourage you to watch that session. Nick Andrews, who presented, is really, really knowledgeable about this work, and it's really powerful, I think, to see some of his examples. But crucially for us, the message there was people are complex, systems are complex, and putting numbers by things are not the best and most meaningful way of actually making sense of it. And that, part of our movement, I suppose, across the New System Alliance and our other partnerships in Platform was about making those changes and hoping to create a system where people can hear stories and understand that they are clear evidence of impact in exactly the same way or a different way, really, to stats and outcome measures. This session then was around how do we campaign for local change, and that's one that I led. Again, welcome to watch that. I will try not to go into loads of detail about it because it's an area that I'm very passionate about. So the reason we included campaigning was that a lot of the connections that we made during the course of the New System Alliance, but also understanding how to deliver strengths-based approaches, was realizing that a lot of the time, whilst you can advocate for people or with people, it's really hard to make changes in local or national systems. That if you're a support worker or a commissioner, it can feel incredibly overwhelming to be faced by a system that definitely does care. It can sometimes feel like it doesn't, but people care. Systems are only ever made up of people. Remember, that's probably the first thing that we'd always share with people. So people were feeling quite despondent when they were talking to us in our conversations that challenge and in our one-to-one conversations. People were saying, well, you've probably all heard it, what's the point? Or it doesn't matter how many people we help in this way, there's not enough housing, or actually, I've already said today about the spring statement yesterday, there are always big things happening to the people and around the people that we support. And it can feel incredibly disempowering to professionals as well as people we support. So the key messages we left with is number one, you always, always, always have more power than you think. No, we don't have the power to shift the Chancellor's fiscal rules yet, but we might do. Politicians will ultimately always respond to movements of people that are powerful, united, and speak with strength. But locally, people have huge power. People have, particularly in local authorities, if you understand who your lead member is for housing or social care, if you're in a devolved area of the UK in any way, often the connections to power and decision makers is much more tangible than it is within Westminster. That often when you see examples where some decisions have been reversed through local campaigns, particularly thinking around things like learning disability provision, People have been able to make huge changes, even in the context of austerity and kind of a growing sense that the UK social system is eroding. So you do always have more power than you think when you're together with others. Alone, we don't, but together we do. Understanding relational approaches. So this is really key, that when we work with people, that politicians are people too. We may not like that. Sometimes it's really hard to see that. I have to fess up there. I find that really hard. But people are people. People do not generally go into politics to make people's lives worse. They go because they have a deeply held belief in making things better. They may disagree on how and why. They may not have maybe the same backgrounds or understandings that some of us do. They may not be as connected to things on the ground, but people don't generally go into politics to make things worse. So once you understand that actually if people can connect to each other, they can still make a difference, that's really powerful. And that's why number three, politics and campaigns is about relationship. It's about, who do you know? It's about how can you make something that can be quite abstract for people feel really real. Um, so, case in point, I know I've mentioned it a few times. That's probably because I'm quite angry about it. So that's me being incredibly open. The news yesterday about the welfare cuts, yeah, is something that has shaken me. Took me a couple of hours to actually make sense of, and I feel very angry about it. Um, but by telling those stories of people, by challenging those decisions, we may not be able to make any difference to the actual decision, but we may be able to start shifting people's attitudes towards that. Old power versus new power. Again, I will not try and butcher this. New power is essentially about movement. Old power is very traditional politics. There's a place for both. But when we have mass movements and people working together, that's when you can make a huge difference as well. And for me, there's something about when you're working in a strengths-based way, when you try and maybe obscure some of those boundaries between people we support and colleagues and commissioners, actually, there's very few boundaries really. So let's break them down, work together rather than against each other, and see what happens, is the very shorthand summary of what we talked about there. And finally, really connection. Connection with people makes change. So personal relationships, especially if you're in a local authority, you will know somehow someone who is probably elected or works in the local authority. So use those personal relationships, not in an improper or inappropriate way, but actually telling and sharing those stories. If you have a ward councillor, going to see them, explaining things to them, really making that effort can be really helpful. Building trust and relations as well. Politicians work predominantly in a culture which is very, very low trust and very high challenge. You cannot go for reflective practice as a politician. You cannot necessarily, as a politician, know who you can trust. If you make any mistakes or if you get something wrong, you don't have a good one-to-one to kind of help you process that. Instead, you're absolutely hauled over the coals in the newspapers and by an opposition. I'm not saying that's wrong, but it absolutely does not create trust. So where we can, working with politicians, helping us understand, helping them know that we understand them and helping them understand us is really important. And again, you'll see that stories element, building movements with stories. A story can capture more than any data can. Data is important. I'm not dismissing data, but we've got plenty of evidence that data is important. So I'm trying to nudge the scale the other way. Stories are what we will bring to make change meaningfully. And again, if you want more information, please do feel free to watch the full video. I'm absolutely going to butcher this one. I apologize. This was delivered by the absolutely brilliant Noreen Blandway, and again, recording is available. And this was how do we embed understandings of power in co-production. So strengths-based working, we've talked a lot, and one of the key themes is co-production. You can't really understand people's strengths and give them the space to act on and use those strengths if we're not working in a co-productive way. It may seem incredibly obvious, but it took me a while. So for me, that's really important. So how do we embed understanding of power in co-production was important to me because a lot of the time we will, as a system, sort of say co-production is really important. Of course it is. And then we try and adopt the same co-productive approach for everyone, regardless of who they are, where they find themselves and what their experiences are. And crucially, without having a little bit of self-reflection about our own power. I've seen, and I've probably years ago said it myself, oh, well, we've made all of these events available. Why is nobody engaging? Actually, maybe it was the wrong space. Maybe it's the fact that we were all white, or maybe the fact that we didn't communicate in the right way. There was very little self-reflection at times, and that's me talking about myself there, being very, very honest. So what we talked about with Noreen was that understanding of power. So do we hold power as experts? Do we hold social power? What's the positional power that we have? So how are we positioning against or with each other? What's the context? So someone has power in certain contexts, but has very little power in others. What's our personal power, even physical. So really understanding that and trying to get ourselves used to not overthinking it in a constant way, you would paralyze yourself, but holding an innate or trying to build that innate understanding of people's power is really important because it helps us use our own power more softly. So if you go into a situation, you think, right, okay, this is me doing my own reflection openly. I'm a white middle class man. Um, and so, yeah, there is power there. Definitely. I know for a fact that when I speak, there are people who listen to me more than they do a lot of more ably qualified women around me. That happens all the time, and I notice it. And so I try and moderate myself appropriately. At the same time, I'm also gay and disabled. So I've noticed it the other way that sometimes I'll be saying things and I'm not listened to in the same way as, say, non-disabled men. Um, and that I think is something that we all carry in lots of different ways. So this is not about saying feel guilty, feel guilty, feel guilty. This is about reflection, reflection, reflection. So what are we saying? Are we really thinking and unpicking why people are listening to us? Are we unpicking whether or not we're actually brilliant? Are we brilliant or are we just white and being listened to? I'm not saying anyone on the call is not brilliant, by the way. I'm sure you all are, but I think it's really important that we reflect on that. Noreen shared the privilege wheel. That's a really helpful way of understanding the different levels of privilege we have. In today's climate, when you look over the ocean at America, I think the idea of being privilege and checking your privilege has become quite it's at risk of becoming quite a hackneyed kind of dismissed sort of approach. For me, it's very much just being open and honest about it, about not pretending that I will never pretend I am not middle class and that I did not have huge privileges as a result. I do not think I'd be where I am with the things I've experienced if it wasn't for the privilege of my family's wealth, essentially. Am I going to pretend that I was as wealthy as Boris Johnson? No, but I'm also not going to hide away from the fact that I had certain protected characteristics that others of my friends that I grew up with did not. The positionality wheel is often the positions we take. So where are we at compared to others? And I think Noreen goes into that in much more detail. I won't kind of speak for her on that one. It's a really good video to watch. The co-production exists at that intersection of people and professionals. And what's really exciting is understanding at what point do we step in with co-production and at what stage do we step in with consultation. And what was really helpful in that video was understanding that co-production is not always the right or the most appropriate response for every situation. And a lot of the time, some of the reasons people might get jaded or cynical about co-production is because we often call things co-production when actually we just mean consultation or making people aware. And it is okay to do that. It is okay to just consult on something if you have made that decision. And that actually, one of the things that came through from that video is about the importance of honesty. Do co-production when you know you're going to do co-production openly and honestly. And if you can't or you're not, don't pretend it's co-production. And finally concluded with the summary of the doing to, doing for, and doing with, which is again, understanding if we can just understand our default approaches. I know Becky will have heard this before when we worked together in New System Alliance, is the doing two, is that fixing thing, jumping in, assuming we know better, um, or taking control, really. Doing four is more of that fixing again, but more, very well meaning, oh, we'll do this for you, show you how, but actually doesn't often promote that independence. And then doing with is much more kind of in balance with that actually you're working with people when they need it, and building that space up for people to do things on their own steam in the way that they want to as well. And then finally, appropriately for the last session, there was the navigating the emotional complexity of endings. And this was really important because one of the things that came through both in the evaluation of the PTS coaching with Changing Lives and Mayday Trust, talking about how to navigate the ending of coaching, but also from a lot of organizations and individuals that were working around strengths-based approaches was saying, well, how do we end it? If we're working in a really strengths-based open way with people and they're really benefiting from it, eventually when we have to end that support, people kind of fall apart. And so we made it really clear that we were going to explore that emotional complexity of endings. Obviously, for all of these sessions, we've been talking about an hour session each. So we haven't fixed it. We haven't got to the bottom of it. These are essentially taster sessions and to help people across the UK really understand some of just the basic core concepts. But fundamentally, one of the things from Sarah, who's a clinical psychologist who delivered this session, it was about taking care of ourselves. It's also about understanding and sharing our experience of endings. So a lot of the time, one of the key bits from this session was that our own experience of endings will impact on the way we want to end things with people, whether that's if we were used to quite abrupt endings and we mirror those, or we were quite used to abrupt endings and so we adopt a very gentle, soft, longer term ending because we don't want to have the same experience. That can impact the way we work. The attachment styles that I was talking about earlier, that they can also impact on the way we manage endings. And one of the key things, I suppose, that we've talked about a lot in Platform is attachment is not just about families. Attachment comes out in our personal relationships as well. And interestingly, a further unpicking of that, which is what is our relationship to help in general? So are we people who ask for help as professionals? Do we ask for help as people, in our personal lives? And if we're not used to asking for help, or if we ask for help all the time, or whatever balance of that spectrum we find ourselves on, how does that impact on the way we actually work with people we support, or the way we design services, or the way we campaign or lobby for policy change? If we assume that people shouldn't ask for help, maybe somewhere deep down, if we would never ask for help, is there an assumption there that we don't think people should ask for help? What does that do to our understanding of how we navigate those endings? And what parts of us might show up as well in that ending? So what parts of it, are some of us resentful, or some of us fearful, or some of us overly attached? Those are the kind of things that we can again really explore. Which seems quite potentially, when you're watching this landing for the first time, I would encourage you to watch the whole session. It is again really helpful, but it's really important that we start having that space again for that reflection in terms of how we show up in our roles, and that yes, the emotional complexity of endings. Yes, there's a huge amount there about contractual obligations, 2-year funding limits. There is some hardwired stuff about the service design that makes managing endings really difficult. But the bits we can control is our emotional response to it, or we can start to understand our emotional response to it. And so that was kind of the way that we finished that session. You can watch all of these, like I said, except for the mental health one, on this link, which we'll make sure we send around. We'll send around after this session to everyone who's booked on, along with the recording. So this coming year, just to give you some spoilers, these are the remaining 5 sessions that we've scheduled. So the first one is next month with Sian, which is again challenging the dominant narrative of mental health. I haven't given everything away, by the way. I've given a very quick summary, so it's definitely still worth logging on. Would definitely encourage you to do that. Number two is working with our communities. So a lot of last year did focus quite a lot on individual support. Actually, increasingly in Platform, what we're looking at is how do we work better with communities by giving power to communities and working on a community level with strengths-based approaches. And that will be delivered most likely by our Deputy Director of Children, Families, Young People and Communities in a couple of months' time. Storytelling, again, this time making it really explicit about how can we use storytelling to make changes in the system. Trying to maybe move away from, whilst not ignoring data, moving away from the idea that if we explain something as that's the equivalent of 2 football acres or 2 football grounds. I can't remember what football is anyway. Yeah, football stadiums, that's what I'm talking about. That there was the old trick in media management that you would always describe things in the number of football stadiums people could fill. And that's all true, and that's still really helpful. But actually, connecting people with stories that are authentic and meaningful is the one of the best ways of making changes, especially in an era where people are finding it harder to know what to believe as well. So yeah, we'll be talking about storytelling. Holding boundaries in a broken system, being kind is not being nice. That might be the longest title I've written, but essentially one of the key themes that kept coming through from people that we were talking to in the reflective spaces was, yeah, all of this is very well and good. Being trauma informed is good, but what if someone's being dangerous? What if someone's, threatening? What if someone is just not doing their job? What if someone just isn't engaging? And it's certainly something that's come up internally within Platform as well. This understanding of kind of how we hold boundaries within a broken system. And again, we'll be exploring that. And then finally, looking after our well-being as campaigners for change. And we've chosen that phrase deliberately because whether you're working in services or not, our roles are campaigning for change, essentially, because we're modeling a different way of being. If you're working within a strengths-based approach, in a broken system, you are by your very nature campaigning for change and you will be making a difference. So that can be incredibly isolating. It can feel quite lonely and it can lead people to being burnt out. So we really want to make it clear that how do we look after our well-being together? And again, there is a link there for people to book on. I'll stop talking just for a few minutes whilst I have a very quick drink and see if anyone's got any questions. And if not, I'll then move on to the system change pack. So if anyone's got any questions, please raise your hand if there's anything you want to discuss before we move on.
Can I jump in? Excuse me. I've got your frog in the throat. I'm just going to pop a link in the chat. Hopefully not to my holiday snaps. No, it's the right link. Oh no, it's the wrong link. Hang on a minute. One moment, caller. So we recently, Platform recently worked alongside Comorth and ACES Hub to publish a reflective practice toolkit starter pack, which may be really valuable for people to have as a resource. Just reflecting on some of the stuff you were talking about there on as an additional resource. So I'll pop that in the chat as soon as I've found it.
Thanks, Pete. Great. I can't see any other hands up. So now that I've had my brief pit stop, I will continue. So the system change pack is a piece of work that we have just concluded, really. The New System Alliance concluded September, October of last year, and we've just been finalising some of the outputs from that. One of the things we wanted to do, so the New System Alliance was disrupted quite a lot by COVID, and kind of what we'd initially hoped for maybe didn't happen in exactly the same way. So what we developed that into eventually was a series of events, conversations, gathering of information, essentially. And so we had recorded all of those just like we are these, and we essentially went through and did a thematic analysis of every single event that the New System Alliance ran over 4 or 5 years, which was lots of conversations. I think it was about 400 or 500 people. And from those, because the focus was about system change, the data was actually really rich. because whilst the conversations were not very, very strictly defined in terms of what type of system change or what type of sector, they were actually all focused on system change. So after that thematic analysis, which my colleague did, we were able to identify four key areas, really, which is we're not saying it's exhaustive. We're not saying this is the only way to do system change. What we are saying, though, is from 400 or 500 people over four or 5 years. These are some of the key themes that emerged, and we wanted to share them with people with some prompts and ideas for practice. And we'll make sure these get sent. They may not be sent today, but certainly very soon we'll send them to everyone who's booked on today, and you are free to use them as much or as little as you'd like. They are one of the kind of, I suppose, gifts from the New System Alliance work, which we are really delighted to be able to share for people. So, oh, I've already done that. So yeah, now one of the key themes, probably just to finish before I move on, is those conversations that challenge were there about challenging each other as well. So they weren't just kind of just learning events. They were learning events where people got together, really talked and explored and interrogated some of the ideas we were talking about, then came back into shared group spaces and really opened up with each other and built by the end of the 4 or 5 years a significantly kind of strong group of people that kept coming together, as well as kind of isolated people that came every so often as well. So yeah, really, really good mix of people within those conversations. So we have four reports, almost. They're very short, very practical. One is understanding that relationships are what make system change possible, but it's not possible to do system change without relationships. It's not possible to have a system at all without relationships. Systems are people. There is a sense, I use it sometimes in this way, that systems are this sort of abstract, distant kind of thing that is there and it just happens. Actually, one of the really key things that is there is that systems are relationships. Systems are made up of relationships, and anyone who's read anything about human learning systems will probably know that inside out already, but it was definitely a theme that kept coming up. The community, and by that we mean communities of practice, communities of interest, but physical, geographical communities, communities of identity. So it isn't just a very strictly defined sense of community, but you can't have system change again without community. It doesn't happen because one person cannot change systems. The power, and again, that's very, very much a lot of what we were talking about earlier from Noreen's session, was what power do we have? What power do we take for ourselves? What power do we share? That, again, if you're trying to change systems, being unaware or unfamiliar with the power we have that people pretend we don't, or the power we don't have that people pretend we do, is really important as well in understanding. And then finally, the learning. So how do we reflect together? We've talked a lot about reflective practice today, but also, what type of evidence are we leaning on? Are we focusing just on data? Are we listening to stories? Are we reading grey literature? Are we talking to people in communities that we don't normally reach? How are we listening to people? How are we getting that evidence and information out? How are we using it? How are we framing it? How are we reflecting on it? And it all comes back full circle. So we have four reports, each of them talking about those areas in a bit more detail. We've also got throughout the reports the elements on the left, whether it's a reflection, a key message, or a good practice idea. And these are, again, things that came through from people that were talking in the meeting. So either reflections that we've had on the thematic analysis, so, oh, actually, this is something that seems like it's coming through a lot. A key message that we think is really important to share, or a good practice idea. So one of the things I really wanted to make sure we had in these reports is that it wasn't just a big, long report about people having conversations, because if you're anything like me, you've probably read thousands of them in your career and you don't just want another one. So I wanted to make sure we had those spaces for people to go, oh, that looks like something I could try, or oh, that's an interesting challenge here for me. So they're designed to be as practical as possible. Two examples then of what that might look like. So as well as those three elements to the left, we've also included at the end of each of those reports some practice tools. Again, absolutely not saying this is how you need to do it, but just some ideas of as we were talking, myself and my colleague, my former colleague Holly, who did the analysis, we talked together about, well, actually, could this be a helpful tool? So we've included it in there for people to use as much or as little as they like. And I've put a copy of Julian's story in there, but throughout each of the reports as well, because storytelling is so important, we've ensured that we have people's stories captured, often stories of change or stories of things they're doing differently, because we wanted to leave people with, again, really practical examples, yes, in the tools and the good practice ideas and the clear prompts, but fundamentally as well to know that stories can make a difference and people are trying it. And so these are those, and you will be sent them, and you can see the key, I suppose, full message underneath each one, which I sort of summarize. So system change needs healthy communities and space to challenge. System change needs us to listen to and value the full range of expertise. Relationships need to be at the heart of everything we do, and system change needs opportunities for everyone to understand their influence. And yeah, we hope that those reports are really helpful for people. So that's it from me, a whistle stop tour, really of the progress so far, reflection so far. I will stop sharing and see if we can stop recording if I can, and then yeah, I'll do that, and then I'll carry on talking in a second. So.